Hello. Welcome back to the David Watson podcast. And today I had a conversation with Jason Edwards. And we were really supposed to be talking about his new book because he has been for many years a photographer for National Geographic. And we did talk about his new book, and that was fantastic. But really what we got into more than anything is probably the last 35, 45 years of his life, which led to the book. And there is a genuine good message in that for everybody. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. And this is the funniest introduction, really, because you and I have already been talking for about 35 minutes from everything from surfing, climate change to politics. And at some point we realised we should probably start a podcast. So, yeah, you're all right. You're doing okay.
Yeah, mate. Well, that's the thing, it's you never know whether we should be putting hitting the record button before we hit the record button or not, but it's all good.
Yeah. I think sometimes I probably should get out of that. Like you and I were literally just talking about when you're being creative, you just got to go with it when it goes. And
Yeah.
you and I had an amazing conversation, and we might even get into it again about climate acceleration. And like where I was like, I'm not a climate person, but I have heard about that, but I know nothing about it. And on one end, but there's this part of me that's like, no, you have to do Welcome to the David Watson podcast and get in gear. And we have a book to talk about. So sometimes I do have these fascinating conversations with people. I think, damn, I wish I'd been recording that. But then there's also this kind of structure and format that enables podcasts to happen. Like, you have a book, which is why you're doing podcasts, to talk to people about the work you do. And so it's really strange because it's just like, am I so supposed to be so structured? Or did you...
You're in the UK, I'm in Australia, and I have a bottle of wine open, so structure's probably already out the window at some level.
I'm drinking water for the...
Yeah,
It's a
that's
bit
what they
early
all
for
say
me
when
to
it's
be having a
gin.
drink. Well, I say it's early. It wouldn't be the earliest, the worst time I've ever had a drink. But
That's right.
yeah. So one of the things when you and I were talking, you mentioned being on the road since you were about 15.
Yeah. So it was, photography was an interesting entree to life for me. I actually started shooting earlier than 15. I went on an excursion to Tullamarine Airport, which is Melbourne. That's where I live, Melbourne's primary airport, when I was 8. And I asked Mum to take her little Kodak canister camera.
Yeah,
Remember those ones were old enough that had the little canister films in them?
yeah,
And back in the day, they allowed kids, can you believe this, on the tarmac.
yeah. I
So
do. I
the first
remember
shots that I
airports being
had,
like that. Yeah,
it's like, can you imagine it? And so they let us there. There was a Pan Am, one of the famous Pan Am 747s there. And it was the first time I consciously remembered shooting, and I still have the frames. And so they let us shoot the plane from the tarmac, then took us up, and I took shots looking over that enormous grey wing. And who would have ever thought I'd form a career where I'd spend thousands of hours looking through that same little porthole? But what I found growing up was that my love of I painted and drew, especially drawing early, and then I went to oils and pencil, and I had this fascination for what should not belong, not what should belong in my composition. So I was really anally retentive about balance in my images. And so when I started shooting again in my early high school years with mum's camera before I got my first camera, when I look back at that work, I see the infancy of that storytelling in my pictures. So when I was 14, 15, my grandmother went to Hong Kong, and I gave her $250, which was what I'd saved from my paper round.
yeah.
And she brought me back a Casina CT7, which at the time a film camera, but apparently the world's first electronic camera. I don't know if that's a true fact, but that was what the advertising said. And a 50 millimeter lens and a flash. And the flash was a gift for my birthday. And I had images published off my third roll of film. And sports images, like most people still do now,
Yeah.
you start shooting friends and things in your environment. And it was that epiphany at that point was I want to make images for a living, and without any ego, I was doing surrealism and fantasy work then. People thought I was going to be the next Dali.
Yeah.
I think that was just being kind, but I actually then started shooting maniacally with film, even in my high school years, trying to at least talk about my environment at that point, my parents with younger brothers, all of that kind of thing. So my shooting career started very early, and I was fortunate to have a win of seeing some of my work in the yearbook. And then when I started at the zoo, and I'm sure we'll talk about the zoo, but it was one of those things that had changed my perspective of how I saw the world at a very early age.
Well, we may as well talk about the zoo. So what was the
Yeah,
zoo?
for sure. So I mean, it was interesting because throughout school, I was fortunate. I enjoyed school. I was good at school. I was accepted into what is not even arguably the most academic school in Australasia. And one entrance exam, you can't buy your way in for love or money. And it was a school that just wanted you to be the best that you could be, whatever that was.
Yeah.
And so a very unusual educational side of things, but that's why they were the academically the best. And so I did maths and sciences all the way through, but I also took art all the way through and art history. And so and I still have that passion for, I don't paint now, but I have that passion for art. But 3 months after I finished high school, at the end of my high school career, I wrote a letter to Melbourne Zoo because a friend of my mum was a waitress. My father was one of these famous long haul Australian truck drivers with the
Yeah.
huge trucks. And so a friend of my mum's at the restaurant said, her sister worked at the zoo. You should write a letter. I did. I got this pro forma response. You know, no, no work. But then 3 months later, I get a letter asking if I'd like to come for an interview. And I went on the Tuesday and I started on the Thursday. I think that's the only time I've ever turned up on time for anything, except for you today, of course.
Yeah.
Um, and so I started as a zookeeper, which is statistically speaking, apparently in Western countries, zookeeping and Nat Geo photographer are the two most sought after pastimes, statistically speaking. So I started with native mammals, working with native mammals, kangaroos, koalas, wombats, things like that, marsupials. But after 6 months, they moved me to carnivores. And I started working with big cats and bears and all of those sorts of meat-eating carnivores and small carnivores. But I was basically the big cat keeper for about 8.5 years, and then I went to primates then to specifically work with great apes and arboreal treetop monkeys. So my studies actually were not in photography at any shape or form. They were in animal sciences and applied science. But throughout that whole career period, and that's I guess a different story, but I built a photography business whilst I was at the zoo,
Yeah.
and that's a different story we can talk about if you like. But being a zookeeper is a fascinating exploration of evolution, biology, and learning to completely disregard anything normal that smells, tastes,
Yeah.
behaviors, all of those kinds of things. I mean, I was the only guy on the primate department. We all just got changed together. We were just none of this wokeism now. It was like we'd all just be buck naked together because you're working with animals all day. It's just normal.
Yeah. I mean,
So
it's funny. We all understand. Well, I don't think we all understand, but I think like you and I are old enough and of a generation that we get that things needed to improve, but once upon a time somebody would just tell you to shut up, and if you got a bit
that's
cheeky or
right.
crossed the line, somebody would just give you a slap and tell you to shut up, and that was it. It was done and
Yeah,
dealt with.
that's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, it was interesting. A zoo story is we actually pulled out some adult movies and put them on a VCR once to try and get some primates to reproduce.
Yeah.
And that was men and women. We did it. There was no separation in the roles. In zookeepers, everyone's equal. And and I laugh at things like that. And there's so many stories like that where you think to yourself, imagine if you did that now. There'd be someone who'd be sitting there going, "Oh my God, I'm scarred for life. Give me $1 million."
Yeah.
When in actual fact, the gorillas were looking at the videos and then looking at us, looking at the videos, looking at us, going, "You guys are messed up," you know. And just like the looks on their faces, you could tell they're going, "This is not right," you
Yeah.
know. And it didn't encourage any reproduction whatsoever, anyway, you
No.
know. So it's
But
but you are 100%
but hey,
right,
life
and
was
you know
good.
that
We could go to work and watch porn and say it was work. It was great. We were living the dream.
exactly. Exactly. And I'm a 20-year-old guy with a boss, female boss yelling at me, "Put the cassette in." Okay, I'm putting the cassette in. I'm
Yeah.
not going to say no,
But that
but
was it.
you are.
People kind of were much
Mm.
more focused. I think people were less focused on themselves and more focused on what we were doing.
Very much so. And I mean, a role as a zookeeper is so intense
Yeah.
because you're spending so many hours every week with non-human species. And it's your responsible to keep them alive and well and entertained and all of that kind of thing. And so the people that you work with become in many ways closer than your family because they are under the same pressures to achieve that. And you're right. What you said before is correct. Many things need to change and change should happen. But back then, if you're doing such a labor intensive role
Mm.
and you've got in some cases endangered or critically endangered species, or even if they're not endangered, it doesn't lessen the value.
No, of course.
Those animals are absolutely dependent on you to get the job done.
Yeah.
And so, there was no messing around. You had a big night at a pub the night before, you still got out there and scrubbed those dens spotlessly at 6 o'clock the next morning, or you're having a bad day or you've had a breakup or whatever. Okay, maybe your boss pats you on the shoulder for 2 seconds and then says scrub the dens, or maybe they don't. There's, there was no
Yeah.
hand holding. It was like, get
Yeah.
the damn job done.
Back in the day, your boss would be like, "You're going to have a tough day." And then walk off and go and do their job.
My boss actually, she was a terror. She actually would, if you were in the bad book, she'd put you on top of the off-limit ape cages, and you'd have to scrub the tops of the little bars with a toothbrush. I can guarantee you, on your hands and knees up on top of that for 9 hours at a stretch, you're going to be well behaved the very next day.
Yeah. What's the off-limit ape cages?
So basically, all of the zoos, most of the zoos in the world will have off-limit areas. So a vast percentage of zoos is not on public display
Yeah.
because they don't want, it's very hard to keep, not to encourage people who would do the wrong thing, but it's very hard to keep zoos secure because, of course, they've often got big boundary fences and things like that. So you really don't want someone coming in and cutting fences or poisoning animals and all of these sorts of things. So vast percentage of zoos is off limits, and so when the public disappear at the end of the day, keepers will bring in the animals to feed them and check their health and work them or do testing. Sometimes they might do testing and things, not experimental testing, but you can train apes to do things for you so you can check their health and things like that. It's so funny. I'm looking at my own hands in mirroring that. That's what you do. So there's a when for the apes, of course, and all the primates, we would bring them, and the big cats and the carnivores for that matter, we would bring them in of an evening. I don't think there was really many species that we wouldn't take off limits in the evening for security reasons, and to make sure that their care was well taken.
I just wanted to ask a completely off topic, in a sense, question about big cats. Because I've always had this theory about, if you want to know what a big cat is like, look at the cat you have at home. And you have some cats at home that are incredibly aggressive, and other cats that are just like, nah, I'm really, really chilled. I mean, I used to have this cat called Squeak, her name was. She lived until she was 22. She was the best micer, ratter I've ever seen in my life. And she was quite a delicate cat. Do you know what I mean? But Jesus Christ, would she, if it was a rodent, she'd kill it, right?
Yeah, okay, there you go. Lucky she's not in Australia. We've got lots of native rodents.
Yeah, she wouldn't square up to another cat, would run a mile. Never in my life have I ever seen her scratch a human or bite a human. Right?
Yeah, interesting.
But I've also had cats that would, like, you couldn't, like, when they woke up in the morning, or you woke up in the morning, you're just like, which cat have I got today? And they'd give you a little look that would be like, I'm going to keep you guessing, mate. And when you're not looking, I'm having you.
Yeah, well, 100%. And I mean, we had a cat called, we just called him Puss growing up, a big black feral cat that lived in our house. And the rule was always, my parents' rule, I was the oldest of the boys, was don't touch Puss unless Puss touches you. Because
Yeah.
he'd be out there attacking Alsatians in backyards and all of that kind of thing. But it's interesting. Some zoos hand raise their carnivores. Melbourne Zoo doesn't. But even then, having said that, the relationships you can form with big cats is quite fascinating. I mean, probably my first true girlfriend was Poetry, an endangered female Sumatran tiger. And she was not hand raised, but I would turn up every morning and she would spray me. She would urinate all
Yeah.
over me. I was hers. She'd be running
Yeah.
up against the wire and everything. And I never did, but I'm absolutely convinced I could have gone in with Poe and it wouldn't have been a problem. She let me watch her cubs when she watch her clean her cubs and all of those
Yeah.
sorts of things. But Frank, her partner, was forever trying to pull me through the fence. He was not a fan of humans at all. Um, but I think it's one of those things with carnivores that, and it's, let me say that in a different way. One of the things that's important with carnivores in captivity, and not all zoos do this, is to ensure, like your domestic cat, that they're entertained.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot going on behind those eyes, and they need that entertainment. And we call it these days in zoos environmental enrichment. So that might be hiding food in the exhibit for them to scent out, or creating balls with holes in them so they've got to get prey out of the holes, or whatever the case might be. And at Melbourne Zoo, for my time there, we had the carnivore dietary preparation complex, which was basically a polite way of saying a slaughterhouse. It was the oldest functioning slaughterhouse in Australia, and we culled other animals to feed to the
Yeah.
carnivores every day. And if you weren't willing to do that, you didn't work with carnivores. Now, it's not an easy thing to do, but I can guarantee you, giving them brains and horns and skulls and bones and offal and fur, so that they had to use all those muscles to do that, was exponentially, and I will go to my grave debating this with anyone who works in a zoo, better than giving a cat a chunk of 2 kilos of meat, where they wolf it down in 2 seconds and then they're sitting there pacing, going, what else is there?
Hmm.
And some of the longevity records for carnivores, that for certain species, were carnivores that I kept at the zoo. But that is partly due to the fact that they had this mixed and varied diet. Now, not all zoos have the ability to do that, or choose not to do it because of ethics or whatever the case is. We never fed live animals to
Yeah.
to the animals. We always dispatched them beforehand. But I think the most important things, and zoos are fascinating for me. If I look at my career of travel, there's an obvious juxtaposition the first time I went to Africa and photographed lions in the wild in Africa, and then coming back and seeing lions in the cage at a zoo. And that's been one of the things that people have often wondered, how I found a balance in that. And I don't know that I ever, excuse me, because I've worked with so many species now, I don't know if I ever found that particular balance. But what I am very aware of is that zoos that do it well, both in education and conservation and management of the species in captivity, are crucial to informing the wider community that don't have the opportunity to go and work with lions in the wild or gorillas in the wild or whatever. So there is a definite important role of zoos and aquaria and things like that in the world, but also too the really good ones. Things have changed over the last 40, 50 years. Animals are not in concrete pens, and you have less animals in a zoo now, so you can have bigger exhibits for them. And we know about environmental enrichment, and we build multi-tiered structures for animals to climb and all of those sorts of things. That's what should be happening. And those animals were not extracted from the wild, so they don't have that point of reference of going whatever. So can you make their life as entertaining and enriching and as physically demanding as you can in a zoo? If a zoo is attempting to do that, then that has a flow-on effect into children and communities and things like that where that zoo is.
Yeah. I guess I yeah, zoos and wildlife parks, I think, are interesting. Are an interesting debate. Where I would sit is if I look at some of the most fascinating people on TV that I grew up with over the years, and the
Mm.
education that I learned, it came from people who started out in zoos and wildlife parks. And some of the best breeding programs we have and everything we know about animals today is from those zoos, those wildlife parks, and they've linked up together around the world. And I think
Correct. Yeah.
if you kind of, if there was this kind of foul sweep where it's like, we're not doing it anymore, I think, and this is where I think people, and I don't want to be clumsy when I say this, but I think it's where ethics kind of, my feelings get hurt of something I don't like without taking on board the consequence of an action. And that if you were to take away zoos and wildlife parks, I think in 50 years you'll find there's very little going on in the world because we've lost generations of educations of the importance.
Yeah, correct. And I think it's interesting. I mean, just this morning I got asked. I was in a meeting with the US, and I got asked when I'm back in the US in the coming weeks whether I'd like to go out to a particular aquarium, and so they could take me out on a boat cruise that they do, so that I could see what they're doing. And they're very keen for me to go out and give some feedback and everything, because I've had an unusual career, and I've been in the captive management space for a long time, and also, doing it in the wild. And they said, would you be interested in doing that? And I said, yeah, I would be interested in doing it, providing, it doesn't conflict with anything else. But yeah, I'd love to do it, purely because it helps me understand as an educator myself how institutions and organizations are trying
Mm.
to bring people on board for that journey. And that is a big part of what I do. I mean, when I set out to do a book, it was interesting, because every year I would go to Washington. I'd do my editorials, whatever, and my editors would say, "Where's the book?" And I'd say, "Where's the money?" And they'd
Yeah.
say, "Where's the book?" And I'd say, "Where's the money?" And the point I made to them was, if you don't have the money, if I get the money, I'm going to go back into the wild and shoot more content, which you're going to get, which will make you more money, and in turn probably me more money, which I'll then go and spend in the wild, because I'm irresponsible and I don't put anything aside. I just get on another plane.
Yeah.
But then eventually I decided that the time was right, and the program that they wanted to do was just taking too long. And so I sat down one day with a glass of wine, maybe a couple of glasses of wine, and without looking at my imagery, I just wrote a list of stories that meant something to me personally. Now, those shoots might have been 3 weeks, 2 weeks, or they could be ongoing 30 years. The Serengeti story started in 92. It'll be a book of its own at some point, but it's already more than 30 years of me, not all the time. Sometimes I'm there 2 or 3 times a year for short periods. Other times I might not get there in the year, but it meant something to me emotionally. So when I do these exercises, or I go in and I visit captive management programs, or I go out with a guide in a national park or something, I'm very curious about that, because I've tried to use the privilege of the opportunities I've created for myself. Not everyone gets to do what I do. It's a
Mm.
privilege. Every day is a privilege. I mean, I struggle to pay for haircuts like everyone else. I've got one tomorrow, by the way, um, and um, and all of those sorts of things. But I am very aware, Dave, that one day for me in the Serengeti, or one day for me in Bhutan, or wherever that might be, is a once in a lifetime opportunity for anyone else on the planet.
Yeah.
So I don't take that lightly. I don't take it lightly in my storytelling. I don't take it lightly as emotionally in a selfish way, because I know how rare it is. So I wrote those. I made that list. The editors and I sat down. We picked 16. I wrote the drafts for 16, and then when they did the mock up, the first 8 were about 500 pages or something. So the 16. So they said, let's split this. Let's do a series.
Yeah.
And telling stories is tough, because after decades on the road, it wouldn't be easier necessarily, but to go through and go, here's some heavy hitting, here's a beautiful picture of poetry, great picture of the girl I loved, as the tiger. Here's this picture and everything. And at some point, I'll do those favorites of favorites. But I also am very aware that photography is the most popular pastime on earth.
Yeah.
So it overtook golf and fishing in about 2014. Now, humans have been telling stories for 60,000 years, Indigenous Australians. We started talking about that before. And so now this is the mechanism by which we tell stories. So when I wrote the book, and I wrote it all, it wasn't ghostwritten or anything, I wanted people to have an insight into, my time on the road and my thought process, because photography is so popular. What am I thinking about when I'm telling stories, or what am I thinking about? How do I compose a picture, or whatever the case might be? What are my criteria? But also, too, hopefully it comes through in the text and the pictures. But I am blessed, mate. I mean, at 15, I had that epiphany of I want to
Yeah.
tell stories with pictures. How many people get that, especially men? Men go through their lives. You only have to look at the suicide rate of males globally. We're not doing well. We're
No.
not doing well. And yet I was a young man in the middle of puberty who had an epiphany that managed through, hard work, luck, or a certain modicum of skill, maybe, to form a career out of it. I mean, that just immediately makes me incredibly lucky, I think.
But it is. I think you said something just at the end there. It doesn't matter what you're trying to do. You're going to need an element of skill, an element of hard work, and an element of luck. And if you get all of that in the right, well, if it just comes together,
Yeah.
you might end up going down a road that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
No, correct. And look, people think that, I've been with Geographic now for 24 years, and I've been on the road for 35 or whatever,
Mm.
and and people would be surprised, I think, to hear that, I get knockbacks. Oh my God, I still get knockbacks. It's like, I'd like to do this. No, I'd
Yeah.
like to do this. No, or whatever the case, or that there's not this, and I'm terrible. I shouldn't say this, but I'm terrible at business most of the time. My US colleagues are all programmed in that US mindset,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they've been infinitely more financially successful than I have. But I'm still on the road, and a lot of them aren't. So maybe by being too cheap and too poor, maybe that keeps me on the road when others aren't. But simultaneously, it is one of those things that, there is no way around any success in life where, and even if you come from money, if you are landed gentry and you have money, and someone can buy you in my genre, the camera gear, and put you on planes for free or whatever, it doesn't mean you're going to have success. Maybe it does, but and there's been plenty of people who families have that kind of net worth to help them buy red cameras and all of
Yeah.
this kind of stuff, and build careers where they haven't had to scrape on the 20-year-old camera body or whatever the case. And that's just the luck of the draw where you're born
Yeah.
into.
That's how the dice
But
roll.
it's how the dice rolls. But the reality is that, I mean, I remember, Dave, in for 10 years at the zoo, I did not take a day off
Yeah.
for 10 years. So if people are wondering, how did I get from, high school published pictures to National Geographic? Well, the reality is that the zoo used to get lots of phone calls from newspapers, books, magazines, whatever. Have you got a picture of a wolf? Have you got a picture of this, whatever? They never had a library. So they said, look, there's this young guy, I was 17, 18, walking around with a camera. I was still doing all my job, but they knew I had a camera. Here's his phone number, and they'd leave a message on my answering machine. If it was a picture I hadn't taken on Kodak Gold print film, I'd go off and take it, and and
Yeah.
and then I'd submit the picture. And so and I was also around all of these press photographers that would come to photograph the new baby gorilla or whatever the case was. So these icons of the industry said to me one day, you should be shooting color transparency, color slide film. It's better, you can reproduce it, so on and so forth. So I switched. But it was funny. At one point, I'd have to look. It was maybe 3 or 4 years into that process. I spent 6 months of my salary for the year, 6 months of it, on a copyright lawyer. And I did a whole bunch of research. There was no internet, nothing. I
Yeah.
had to buy things, whatever. And we drafted a brutal contract. And that is still in play now, believe it or not. But one of the clauses in that contract was that if you don't publish my name, I will bill you an extra 100%. So if you paid me $100, I'll bill you 100 again for not publishing my name, because there was no way to get my name out there.
Mm.
And I was the only one in the country doing this. I was 18,
Yeah.
and so 18 or 20 years old or something. So what my days went like this. I'd get up at 6, I'd work for 2 hours, I'd go to the zoo at 8. I lived across the park from the zoo. My morning smoko, I'd work on the business.
Yeah.
Lunchtime, I'd ride home, I'd work on the business. I'd ride back to the zoo, In the afternoon, Smoko, I'd work on the business. I'd come home after the zoo. I'd do 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Then I'd have dinner with my girlfriend. We'd watch the X-Files or whatever the case was on
Yeah, yeah.
TV. Then we'd spend some time together. She'd go to bed. I'd work till 3 a.m. And then I'd go to bed for 3 hours. I'd get up at 6 and I'd do that again. And I did that every day for 10 years. The money I earned from my job at the zoo, I spent on airline tickets and camera equipment, $60 lenses, $50 lenses, rolls of film, you name it. And it was brutal. You can imagine that I had some long-term relationships that did not survive that exercise, and
You
that
got
when
to
I'd
sort
get
the wheat
home,
out from the chaff.
yeah, that's right. Well, the house would be empty of furniture,
Yeah.
and it'd be like one of those things where I'd be going, wow, it's happened again. But that was the sacrifice I was willing to make. And it was only just recently I was speaking to a mate of mine from those zoo days, my best mate from that zoo time. And he looked at me over the dinner table. I hadn't seen him for a while, and he said, "You have no idea." He said, he said it as if I knew, but he said, "You have no idea how people didn't understand how single-minded you were, not
Mm.
about fame or fortune, but about seeing the world and making your photography better." I mean, I stopped looking at anyone else's books or magazines 4 or 5 years into shooting because it was messing with my head.
Yeah.
I didn't want to see what anyone else was shooting. And it was probably 15 years before I bought my first photography book after that. And it wasn't even a genre that I was actually interested, like that I shot myself, because I wanted to see how other people saw the world. But that enabled me to build a style, I guess.
But I just,
And but who would do that? Most people wouldn't do that.
well, I just want to track back on something because you said something really, and only because people who listen to this, right, it's something that people need to understand. Like, you went to work every day for 10 years. You never had a day off, right? Now,
Correct.
some people who listen to this will know this. I'm a full-time care worker, right? So and this is done in my spare time. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm on a day off today, but technically this is working because
Yes.
you will be aware of how many times we had to rebook, how difficult it is to organise these things. I'm going to have to edit it. Do you know what I mean? Right? And you've got other shit to do as well, right?
Yeah.
And I was reading an article this morning, and people are complaining about having to go back into the office, right? And because they like working from home. Yeah, great. If you're a care worker, it's 7 days a week, 24/7. If you're a zookeeper, it's 7 days a week, 24/7. So all these people that I'd love that job. No, you wouldn't, because on Christmas Day, when it's your turn to be on the rota, no one gives a shit that you're at work. No one cares. And I don't want to be too brutal about this. Nobody cares when a member of your family dies and you can't attend a funeral, because you have to go to work, because animals, clients, whatever, are relying on you, because guess what? Everyone else is on their day off, and
Correct. Yeah. 100%,
they've earned their day
100%.
off, and they're really sorry for your loss and your inconvenience. They're really sorry it's Christmas Day, but guess what? I've worked my Christmas days,
Yeah. I did 11 Christmas days in a row at the zoo because I needed time off in other points in the year
Yeah.
to disappear and shoot.
And this is what I mean. So I'm just trying to relay this message to people that
Yeah.
if you want something, and
Yeah.
don't think like, if you look at how you achieve what you achieve. There's a comedian in the UK and called Jimmy Carr, and he said people will be jealous of your success, but they won't be jealous of how you got there. And
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
and like you said, you worked 11 Christmas days in a row because you needed other days off to go and shoot with money out of your own pocket. That was, if I want to do this is what it's going to cost. And I just want to emphasize that point to people, because there isn't, even if you are gifted with wealth, you've still got to be sat somewhere maybe for 3 or 4 days in the pissing rain, keeping still, in the hope that something interesting will come down the road. And it might not.
And it may not. And also too, it's also one of those things that When it does come down the road, if it comes down the road, you're in a situation where if you screw it up, there are no excuses.
Yeah.
So there is a model. When I started, there's always a baby, there's always someone who's the youngest in any employment. And I remember when I was contracted with Geographic, I was the youngest. And on my first meeting, the vice president said to me, make pictures, not excuses. We don't care if it's raining, if the animal doesn't show, or the culture won't let you in, or whatever. We don't care. And it was interesting when to sort of to bring in, and I agree with everything you just said. It's one of those things that even now in my career,
Hmm.
that I have a wife and a son, and they've always had the privilege, not on every shoot, but of coming with me to New Guinea or Antarctica or whatever. But I am working when they are with me. Like I will take time off on school holidays or whatever to be with my son. Of course, that I've had that ability to do that. But the reality is our family holidays are not family holidays for me because it's my skill or lack thereof, depending on the day. I don't want to jinx the god of photography that that gets me into Antarctica with my family.
Yeah.
I'm not there to sit there and watch penguins with them all day. I will, of course, but if I come back without any pictures, that's not going to happen again. And it was interesting because I did not believe. So it was to segue back to. So I built a stock agency whilst I was at the zoo. I had the contract. I built the stock. I was relentless,
Mm.
relentless, and I wasn't ruthless. I was just relentless on myself. And so I ended up started getting calls from magazines, Australian Geographic, BBC, whatever. Can you shoot this for us in it? And if people wonder how it works, every model is the same. The first job is a 2 hour shoot. Go and shoot this. Go and shoot this. If it works well, maybe you get 4 hours. Maybe you don't hear from them again. Maybe you get a day. Maybe you get 3 days, and then eventually maybe you get field work. And that's the model that's always been because you have to prove to an editor, forget your post production
Mm.
skills. Who cares? any Everyone listening to this will have more post-production skills than me.
Yeah.
That's not even a line. I don't do that. My post-production 17 seconds and I'm in and out there. If the raw files or this transparency, I still shoot film, is not good, then I bin it. And so it's one of those scenarios that once I've been working for some of these publications, I called National Geographic, cold called them, literally got the reception number from the magazine and called up. And then I said, can I speak to someone I was only doing wildlife at that point. Can I speak to someone in wildlife? And they said, please hold. And then they came back, reception came back and said, what's your name, please, sir? And I gave them my name. The lady that answered the phone was the director of wildlife photography for the magazine. And her opening line was, we've been waiting for you to call. So for all those
Yeah.
years, they'd been vetting me, or my name had been crossing their radar. They'd been looking at the work I'd been shooting, the stories I'd been telling, who I was as a person, what my background was, and everything. And people now, to your point, say, okay, I've got 1 million followers on Instagram. Okay, well, no one really cares. Is your work good? But more importantly, as a documentary or a reportage photographer or a wildlife photographer, how good is your raw? So I have a saying, it's only my saying, show me the raw. It's not
Mm.
a challenge, but that's what I want to see. I want to see whether someone got it or whether they built it later.
Yeah.
So basically, she asked me to pitch a story. I did. I submitted some transparencies. They got me to go out and do another 3 or 4 shoots towards it, which I funded all by myself. They
Yeah.
didn't have a budget. Then they turned around, looked at it and said, it doesn't fit the next 18 months, but we'd love to break it up, put some in the magazine. They did that. I was suddenly in National Geographic magazine. Then it got really surreal because they said, would you like to come to Washington and bring 150 frames that you think tell your career? And I'm a baby at this point. I'm still a baby now, I tell myself. So I found 150 frames. I funded myself, the accommodation, the airfare, everything. So all of these
Yeah.
trips I funded, whether I was South America, Africa, Asia, Australian deserts, it didn't matter. Wherever I went, people need to realize that unless I was doing an assignment for Australian Geographic or whomever, I self-funded everything for 15 years. Then I turned up in Washington. I presented that work 44 times over 10 days. And then they finally pulled me into a meeting and said, we think you belong in the family. And then they slid across a big pile of paperwork with the words contract on it. But before they even let me take it, they told me to get a lawyer because they're American. And then they gave me this litany to think for people who think, okay, you're on the gravy train now, you will get divorced more. You will be sick more. You will be at home, away from your family more. You'll be this litany of disasters. And then you'll shoot something for 5 years and we'll still say no.
Yeah.
Things like that. Everything that they said has happened to me in my career. But the benefits of working with such an organization where they're like the BBC have had more than a century of trying to change people's understanding of the world and the culture and the ecosystems that we live in. All of that, as much as there's been some terribly hard times, again, as I said before, it's been a privilege. But it's not a holiday. As much as I might get the odd margarita on a beach and I never knock it back, the reality
Why
is
would you
that
not back a margarita?
why would you? Why would you knock it back? But the reality is that I think very few people, and I think you hit the nail on the head, very few people understand, regardless of what people do for a living, what might have gone on before they see
Mm.
the end result that they're seeing, whether it's on social or TV or whatever the case might be. I think, and I'm not doing a woe is me. I hope it doesn't come across
No,
as
no,
that
no. I
because
think it's an
that's what I'm
excellent
doing.
example of look. This is when, like, my podcast is still growing, and
Mm,
I was fortunate enough a few months ago to have a conversation with the Bishop of Ramsbury,
okay.
and it was about how they're repurposing churches because obviously
Mm,
some are not being used. Some are, they're all being used in some capacity. But it's like, how can we use them more in the community? And the reason I mention that because I was fortunate enough to meet him at a talk where he was giving a talk, and I went over and introduced myself and said, "I'm some random bloke you've never heard of, and I'd love to have a chat with you about this in more detail." So it was a bit of backwards and forwards, and yeah, he eventually agreed to come on the podcast. An incredibly nice guy. And
mm.
after the podcast was done, I suddenly had this epiphany. I'm sure there's some magazine or something called the Church Times, and I found it. Yep, there is. So I emailed them and said, "This podcast with the Bishop of Ransbury, would it be something your readers are interested in?" And the editor was like, "I'll send it to our media people." And they then come back and said, "Yeah, we've looked at it. What exactly is it you want?" And I was just like, "Don't know really. I just think because it's church related, it's the Bishop of Ransbury. He spoke brilliantly. I just thought your listeners might like it. If you want to put it on your website, suggest it or whatever." I said, "I'm not owning any copyrights on it. You're free to chop it up if you want." And I just said, "This one, if you could mention the podcast, I'd appreciate it, but it's not necessary." They featured it as their podcast of the week.
Oh, nice. Yeah, yeah.
All
And
because
and
I
you
didn't demand anything. Just think your people might be
know,
interested in it. If not,
yeah,
no fears. If you do, if you could, and I got this little podcast of the week, and they were like, really appreciate that.
yeah, and that's what makes the world go round, isn't it? And and for all those people who are sitting there going, when the hell is that Aussie going to shut up? I apologize in advance. It's but because Aussies never shut up. That's the problem with us. It is
Trust me, sorry
interesting
to cut
that
you off. The best podcast guests are the ones that don't shut up.
no, that's probably true. But it is interesting, the journey that life takes. And there's a line in the book that I probably hopefully said it more eloquently than this, but do you remember the dot to dot drawings that we used to do as kids? You'd find number one and
Yeah,
then you'd find
yeah,
number
yeah.
two and I don't know if they still do them or not, but basically they're great teaching aid for counting. And maybe it comes out as an elephant or whatever it comes
Yeah,
out
I
at.
remember.
But there's a line in the book where I talk about that. I guess one of the things that I hoped is that my dot to dot drawing of my life, when I get to the end of it, whenever that is a picture that I find interesting.
Yeah,
And one of the things that I've tried to do and is to build a career and a life around the things that give me joy, even if some of the things that I shoot are horrific. I mean, not every story is a beautiful leopard in a tree or smiling indigenous face or whatever the case might be. And there's stories that I'll come out in future books that where I talk about that, but and show some of those pictures. But it is also one of those things that I think when when you meet people, and I know this myself when I travel and even like meeting you, and like you said, we had a great chat before we started. It's one of those things that is what makes life go around. And to stay on the road for someone like myself, I get paid to be at 30,000 feet. So if I'm not in the air, I'm not getting paid. So that's
Yeah.
impetus anyway for me flying. But simultaneously, it's one of those scenarios where I have to find everything and everyone interesting
Yeah.
because I might go back to some countries 10 times. That might mean 10 other places I'll never get to. But the story requires me going back 10 times, or maybe I'm not even planning to go back, and Geographic says we need you to go back to Bhutan or whatever.
Mm.
And then I think to myself, okay, how can I do it differently? How can I see it differently? I don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to rain? Is it going to pour? Is it going to be sunny? Is it going to be snowing? And so I have this philosophy in life, and especially in my photography, and I don't compare it to anyone else's. I don't even Google where I'm going 99% of the time. I just turn up.
So,
Is it better or different?
so
No research. No,
the reason I'm laughing, right, because you don't Google where you're going. Here's the
yeah,
check sheet that was sent to me, and
yeah,
I haven't
yeah.
asked you a single question of it, because I don't read people's books. I don't read their books. I
Yeah,
scan that at best, and the
yeah, yeah.
reason being is I rely on my curiosity. That's
Well, yeah, exactly.
my
Yeah, yeah,
philosophy.
and
And
that,
I started
yeah.
this, the philosophy behind my podcast is everybody is interested. If somebody has a passion, they are
I
interested
saw
for at
that when I looked
least
you up. Yeah,
30 minutes if you will listen to them.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's a great philosophy. And I mean, look, for me, it's one of
But
those
it's
things
just how
that,
ours are parallel to each other.
yeah, yeah, there's quite a few, I think. And look, the thing is too, is that, like I was just back in, and this is not name dropping, but I was
No.
just back in Bhutan this, and I was watching monks debating. So the Buddhist monks debate, and they debate over their knowledge of the scripture. And I was watching them, and I've seen monks debate a couple of times in my career. And I was sitting there, and then I was thinking to myself, I wonder if I moved myself to this position, maybe they're just going to stop and go, okay, cool. No, you can't be there. But they didn't. They just sort of, were happy for me because I move in a different way because it's what I do
Yeah.
365 days a year, maybe. But I put myself in a situation where I got a couple of frames where I went, wow, that's the equal best, but it's just by my own standard, no one else's. But that's the equal best monk debating shot that I've got. And it's very different to the previous one that I had. So for me, if nothing else from those days that I spent in Bhutan, I added to my Bhutan story
Yeah.
with one frame. And my experience and my memory of that was very different. And when we started laying out the book, so we picked these 8 stories, and some of them have different sections in them and things like that. So it's like it's more stories, but just deciding what could possibly go in from an image perspective is always tough. Everyone has the same problem.
Yeah.
It's better to have too many than too few, but also too, it's about trying to connect with people that I've never met and take people on that journey. That's a big part of the book for me. It's, yeah, this is my journey, and it's not better, it's just different to someone else's. But even at the back of the book, because I ran a scholarship for National Geographic for many years, and it was, you had to show me a place you'd been in 5 images, and you had to put a little caption with each. And the winner gets to come with me on a Nat Geo assignment. So I put in the back of the book these criteria by which I judge my own work and my own thought processes, because people are often shooting in the dark, to coin a metaphor,
Yeah.
and so people can look at all of that and go, well, his brain's actually doing this stuff that's in the back of the book. Maybe if I can do one or two of those things, or 5 or 6 of them, or whatever, I'll see the world differently. Now, for me, it doesn't matter in the scholarship when I was running, and I plan to reboot it when I get the place. As I said to you, I'm moving,
Yeah.
the office and the teaching place down the coast. I'll reboot it for more bodies because I'll have space to do more than one person. But it is one of those scenarios where people need help in
Mm.
different ways. And for me, it's like my ability to communicate or teach or to take people on that journey in that scholarship. I didn't care if it was one of the winners actually one year, and I had dinner with her Friday last week, We're still friends. And they're not always from Australia. They've been from all over the world. But her story was on her grandfather with Alzheimer's in a tiny little city, Sydney apartment. Other people have done a park. It could be Stonehenge
Yeah.
in four different frames in different times of the year. I just need to see the story because that's what people want out of their photography. And so when I sat down to break up those stories and try and think about how I saw why they mean so much to me, I couldn't have all the pictures that I wanted. Of course I couldn't because, the you just don't have the space.
Mm.
But I tried to think about people who might not have those opportunities but have those interests, and how it might change as I've done with my career. Really, it's the Buddhist in me, to be honest. How am I impacting someone's life when I'm with them, or someone I've never ever met and will probably never ever meet? And for me, that's what helps keep me on the road because I have to leave my wife and my son, and that's terrible.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave them. When I get in the field, I'm in the zone, and I'm watching wildebeest or I'm watching monks chant or whatever, and it's staggering. But I now want to share that with them. So there's always this tortured juxtaposition. Whereas when I'm actually working, and sometimes it's not safe at all where I am, but I don't want them with me when it's that scenario, of course. But it's one of those things, as I've sort of said a couple of times, is that I think anyone can do. I've always gone about this thinking, I want everyone to think that they can do what I do and have the opportunities that I have. It doesn't mean they'll financially that'll happen, or that someone in a less developed country will be able to get to the Himalaya or whatever. That's not
Yeah.
the point. The psychology for me is I want everyone to think they are capable, if this is a passion for them, of telling better stories and getting them out there. And if I can do that through the book or podcasts or whatever the case might be, then that's a win for me. That's a win.
When you were talking earlier, and I've forgotten exactly how you said it, so I might screw this up royally. Um, did you say something about when you were learning about photography, taking pictures and stuff? It's what you leave out. Is
Yeah.
that what you
So
said?
basically, yeah, so in a fashion, so when I was drawing and painting, I was
That
more
was it. Sorry.
concerned about yeah, I was more concerned about the elements that didn't belong than the elements that did belong.
That's how we said it
Because
originally, people, that I screwed up
yeah,
paraphrasing.
yeah, no, that's all right. And it was more because I think everyone has a certain level of compositional skill. Everyone has that. And part of that, to put the scientist hat humans evolved as predators. It doesn't matter whether you're vegan or vegetarian.
Yeah.
We're mammals, our eyes are in the front of our skulls. Evolutionarily, we became omnivores and
Sorry to upset you,
and predators.
folks. It's the truth.
It's the biology of millions of years of
Yeah.
evolution.
We're not vegans.
And so yeah, that's right. So when you see the world, that's why the rule of thirds, the old
Yeah.
tic-tac-toe works so well in a composition, because the way our brains function with where our eyes are placed in our skulls, that balance works for us. So if you presume that everyone can do some level of composition, some better than others because of how they see the world, then okay, what is the point of difference? What is going to be the element that you build on that makes your image different? And so for me, if I put something in that didn't belong, it wasn't really for me, oh my God, that doesn't fit that composition. It was like, no, that just, it was crazy. I remember my mother when, they have parent teacher nights, where your
Yep.
parents go and really speak to the teachers. And so I turned up with a pencil drawing. It was very surrealist. There was cubes floating in the air and very, very minimalist. But on one of the cubes was a set of breasts. I'm
Yeah.
16 or
Yeah.
17, and so they're there, and there's other things on these cubes. So mum sees it. She makes me rub out the boobs. And so, of course, I said to mum, well, that's insane because you can't give that to a female art teacher at that school. And I went, okay. So I turned up, and of course, what's the first thing that the art teacher did? Because I was recently strong at art. Where are the boobs? Because she could see the lines on the
Yeah.
page.
Yeah.
So my mother turned up, and for parent teacher night, and my art teacher ripped her a new one. Ripped her a new
Nice.
one.
We like that.
Don't you ever tell that boy to remove something or add something. We don't even know where his brain is going with composition. This is just, you can't touch him. And so mum came home and it was a big thing in our house for mum to apologize. Mum came home and said, I'm sorry, I'll never interfere with your creativity again. And I think that was more incentive for me to go down that path at such, again, puberty, such a developmental age, where when I started creating photographs, and I didn't have thousands of frames or anything, I was buying rolls of 24 Kodak Gold. Every frame had to count.
Yeah.
And so when I was doing that composition, I was already coming humbly, I'd most definitely say humbly, from a position where my compositional skills had already had 10 plus years of drawing and painting and things like that. Um, and so I was throwing elements away, just throwing them away. No, a hot spot, like a drop of water in the background that catches a bit of light that distracts from the story I'm trying to tell, or the foreground. People don't look in their foregrounds and their backgrounds. So even as a kid, I'm sitting there going, you don't belong. You
Yeah.
don't belong. I hadn't even finished building my composition. It was just, I was throwing things away, less is more, which is ironically a model that Geographic's always worked off. And it's on my business card. I've always had it as a model, but you can have 10,000 animals in a picture, but that doesn't mean you have 10,000 animals in a picture.
Yeah.
What you actually have in that picture is the limited elements that hold it all together, the anchors that hold it together. So, yeah, so it was interesting. Yeah, I hate and I am hard on myself if I don't see things. And people will be sitting there maybe going, yeah, but you just clone it out in Photoshop or you do this in Lightroom or
Yeah.
whatever the case might be. But for me, it's like when I see that, unless I'm sick and even then I don't cut myself that kind of slack, but I will be sitting there going, that is not acceptable. I should have seen it. And I'm more hardcore than probably anyone at Geographic about that kind of thing. But that's also part of what keeps me on the road. It's that challenge of doing it better or doing it different, not by the world. How do you even compete with that? I mean, I don't know coding on social media or anything like that. You see people get enormous followings and they're throwing a banana against the wall. Power to them. That's great. I've had to learn that my own race is my own race, and
Yeah.
that's what I'd say to people. If you're shooting stuff and it's just in your local village or whatever, and you're private about it and you're shy about it and you're uncertain about your work or whatever the case might um, be really annoying and go to my website and turn around and send me an email and go, hey, Jace, does this picture work? And then annoy me in another week's time and say, hey, did you see my picture? And eventually I'll get to it. I'm like Ringo Starr. I'll eventually get to all the responses. Because sometimes people just need a bit of direction, but I'm on a plane a lot, so sometimes
Yeah.
it takes me a while to get to people. But the thing is that don't be afraid. Yeah, okay, be afraid. That's a silly thing to say. We're all afraid to do things publicly, but turn around and go to the local cafe or
Mm.
the library or something like that, and just say, hey, do you mind if I put a couple of prints up? If you don't feel comfortable selling them or you don't know how much to put on them or whatever that whole art market's a nightmare for all of us. So don't feel alone there. We all feel insecure about it. But just ask someone if you can put a single print up,
But honestly,
and then
if
it's
somebody
amazing. It'll change your life.
if somebody's
You know.
listening to this, and there's two things. I'm sorry because I did cut you off and I didn't mean to, but it's something I want to say. If you're taking pictures and you'd love for them to be displayed in a cafe for somebody to purchase, take away all of the pain points. Just say to them, I've covered the costs. Here's the print. Would you allow me to put it up and on an almost donation basis, but be really sensible and say 20 quid and you can keep the money. All right? Take away the pain points for them and maybe you'll get lucky and you'll end up spending, £100 or $100, whatever it is, over a couple of months, over a few pictures. But you might then get invited to somebody say, would you put this in an art exhibition for us? A local magazine, the local paper might end up promoting it, doing a piece on you. Somebody might actually start sharing it on their social medias. Oh, I've got this. It's a local picture. And it's the reason that people feel afraid is because of that thing that happened with the boobs. right? Your mum told you
Mm,
not to, but you were really lucky that a teacher came along and said, "Don't tell him to do that." And your mum come back and said, "I shouldn't have done that." So you,
mm.
because down the line, if that had stayed, that's what you would have been afraid of everyone's opinion.
Correct. That's 100, absolutely 100% correct.
But
Yeah.
somebody nipped that in the bud and gave you, "Don't ever take my opinion on board again when you're doing your creative work." And
Yeah.
do you know, we were talking about you don't know what's lucky and what isn't. That is
Mm.
probably the turning point that set the rest of the road to be laid.
Yeah, potentially.
Because
Yeah.
a teacher
Yeah.
told
Yeah.
your mum, "Don't stop him from
Mm.
doing that."
Yeah.
So
And we had no, and that's you're exactly right. And the funny thing was is that, when I shot my friends playing in the house competition, it was a big school,
yeah,
it had facilities. But it was one of those things. And as I said, mum was a waitress, dad was a truck driver. We had no money in the
yeah,
house. Mum and dad cared for my brothers and I, but we weren't living where there was just film to buy or anything like that. So if you don't have resources, that is not a prohibitor in the long term. I was exactly the same, and you'd chip away, run roll of film or
mm,
whatever at a time, or you use your phone or whatever the case might be. But it's fascinating because you don't know, the two things that as I've gotten older, that I've really latched onto is you don't know what you don't know,
yeah,
and you don't know who you don't know, to your point. And you don't know how these things are going to be perceived. You don't have to. Everyone keeps talking about exhibitions, and I've got to have 20 frames and I've got to have whatever. No, if you've got one frame you really like you said, put the one frame up.
yeah,
And a mate of mine, actually, who's a marine biologist, he did a project in his local community where, I don't even know what you call it, but where we see them all around the UK. I've seen them myself in the UK and everything, where people, it's almost like butcher's paper. So it's printed on, and then people, it gets whitewashed onto a wall,
yeah,
so it's removable graffiti, I guess,
yeah,
so because I hate tagging. I hate when people, just, there's any taggers out there, I hate that stuff that you guys do. Be clever, paint something beautiful,
yeah.
that's fine.
Although
Or paint
Melbourne
something
has a
interesting.
great street graffiti scene,
We have a huge street graffiti
but it's
community,
the
and
best art I've seen.
yeah, it's amazing. And but the thing is too is that, if say a tagger comes along and tags someone piece of work,
Oof.
you expect those guys to be hunting them down because that's
And
art,
rightly so.
But- and rightly so. But if you were ever wondering, so my mate's project was, he had some work. He picked a few pictures that he shot literally in his local park. Now his park has a little wetland in it and some birds and ducks or whatever. And then he went to the local council and he said to them, if I get these printed on this thin paper, whatever it is, so that I can put it on the wall of the library or put one on a bus stop or put
Mm,
one whatever, they can be removed. It's not going to damage anything. They've probably got a longevity, depending on the time of year, of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. And they went, fantastic. And they
yeah,
actually gave him a couple of $100.
yeah,
And they turned around and they said, we'll give you, how much is it going to cost? And my mate's name's Chris, and he's an amazing photographer. And so Cookie turned around, and I can't remember what that project cost, but just making up a number, if he turned around and said, well, it's going to cost me $50 each at the local printers to get them printed on this paper or whatever. And then I've got to have this removable glue or whatever. And they turned around and said, okay, well, what about $400 or $200 or whatever
yeah,
it was? He covered some of the cost himself. He went and got them printed, put them up, and put his name on the bottom of them with his mobile number and all of that
yeah,
kind of stuff. He has now gone on. His surname's Cook, so I call him Cookie. So Cookie's now had probably, he'd at least have had 10 grants from councils and stuff like that. I have not been able to get in my entire career a single grant. $200, $2,000, forget it.
yeah,
I have had no luck with that stuff, but Cookie persevered by literally saying, I'll take $200 and I'll do $400 or I'll do 50 quid or
yeah,
whatever the case might be. Or I'll cover the whole thing myself. All of his stuff wasn't grants. And we do different work. He's in that art space. I'm in
mm,
editorial. So the fear is there. And if you don't think that if you think that the fear goes away, you are kidding yourself. There
yeah,
are a handful of artists in the world, photographers, painters, sculptors, whatever, where they are genuinely so confident that they just go, my work is worth $250,000 and that's what it is, and I don't care.
Yeah.
Everyone else is faking it till they make it. And I mean,
I
my book is no different. I'm terrified that people won't look at it and just go, "Well, this guy's a fraud." But the book's done now, so and it weighs 3 kilos. So if you buy two, you can do bicep curls with them.
no,
But
it's
but
but
so,
you say that. I
uh,
think this is 167, 168 episode for me, and I'm
oh really?
staring at my phone, waiting for you to come
Hmm.
online.
Yeah,
Well, before
yeah.
this
It
started,
doesn't get any easier.
no,
It doesn't
it's
get any
not. It's
easier.
no. It's
Uh,
the easiest one I've ever did was the first podcast because that was with somebody I knew. Everyone
yeah,
after that is somebody I've never met before, and
yeah,
if I'm not in the mood, they don't care. If I'm staring at that phone like, what's the time? Have I got an email saying they've cancelled? And that's the same
yeah.
for every podcast. And yet,
Every
the
single thing.
best
Yeah,
conversations I ever have are on these podcasts. They're the most that I
yeah.
love doing them. You know, but there is
And
a build up where I'm
yeah.
like, I don't know if I can keep doing this.
Well, also too. The thing is that the personal interactions and personal projects are so crucial. They're so crucial for your own development as a person,
Mm,
and that's what a lot of people fail to realize in life. And I'm talking whether you're 65, 75, 85, or 15, or 10, or 25, it doesn't matter. These things that we do for ourselves that challenge us, they are, they are the things that break down those barriers. And it's like, and it's interesting for the physicality of what I do. My day pack is 30 kilos.
yeah,
I carry that from 4 or 5 in the morning until whenever the sun goes, that kind of stuff. And I still shoot film on every shoot as well, by the way, in an old Hasselblad. Um, and then I will carry that 7 days a week for every day of that shoot. But when I'm home, I have to get in the pool a few times. I'm an ex-state level swimmer and lifeguard. I get in the gym, I ride my bike around the park, I get on the treadmill and walk. I don't do heavy weights. I look like I do, but I don't because I do just lots of tendon stuff,
yeah,
these things for lifting cameras and things like that. And because my job is 24/7, and if I don't do the training, I wind up like every other photographer whose neck or shoulders are screwed and I can't carry the gear. And I have carried that gear for 35 years, and I'm knocking on wood here. You can hear me knocking on wood, but I have to put in the yards when I'm home. Otherwise, all this, and you think of a disease, I've had it. I've had arms stitched back on. I've had disc punched out of my neck, broken bones, shattered tendons torn out of bones, fingers cut off, insects behind eyeballs. I had lava in my right ear a couple of months ago. All of these kinds of things. My body is a cesspool of
now that's a
disease and
dating
rebuild.
profile for you. I had lava behind my
Yeah, there
eyeballs.
you go. I know. If you want to come out with me and see if you can catch a fungal infection, I'm your guy. You know, so it's like it's a full time life choice. It doesn't have to be that way for everyone, but even with all of that in play, Dave, it's one of those things that I sit there and I get off a plane, and in the back of my mind is, am I going to be able to produce what I know I need to produce to satisfy my own demons, because I still have them,
Yeah,
and also my requirements to the organization, which is paying me to be there. I mean, I'm not paid to sit on the beach, I'm paid to make pictures. So, or stand in front of a camera if I'm on TV or whatever the case might be. My thing to everyone who's potentially listening is that it's not going to go away. So just you may as well get in the pool. You're not going to ever feel good about, well, no, that's unfair. You may get to the point where you feel more comfortable with it, which is the best most of us can deal with.
yeah,
And then you sit, you fake it, and everyone thinks you're completely at ease. But the reality is that you know unless you get out there and start showing people some of your work, and social can be so rewarding, social media can, and simultaneously it can be so soul destroying because
yeah.
people either like your stuff or they don't. That just stuff breaks my brain. It breaks my brain. And so I just go, I put it up there. If people like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't. I am thankfully so busy these days that I'm not even getting to look at the shoots properly before I'm on a plane again because
Yeah.
Melbourne had the world's longest lockdown. So I lost everything. For me, it was 2.5 years because
Yeah.
Geographic wouldn't put me on the road for 2.5 years in case I got locked out of Melbourne in another country. So, the last 18 months, 2 years, I've gone back to back to back to back, trying to get everything back on track. But I still look at those shoots and I think to myself, did I do it as best as I could do it? Did I miss an opportunity? Did I do this? But I'm also trying to be kinder to myself because I'm one person.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all you're one person. You're in care, you're doing this, you're connecting communities in both of your careers. You're trying to change lives, you're introducing people to people that never would meet them in the first place. I mean, the responsibility is enormous for that because, the reality is that you have no control, that butterfly effect that
No.
comes through your connections that you make, you have no control over that, but you're a nice guy and you want it to go well not
Mm.
just for yourself. You want it to go well for the communities that you touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the that's the stuff that for me that keeps the world going around. And there's so much doom and gloom, but
But
misery
that's
loves company. I don't even know which philosopher said that, but
mm.
misery loves company. And there's so many. Yeah, there's
But
things we need to fix on the
one
planet,
of the
but
things,
world's amazing.
but
Yeah,
that's one of the things I talk about is I just got
yeah,
sick and tired of all the division I'd see. So I thought, you know, I'll just find people I want to talk to, and that can entertain me instead. And you and I had an interesting conversation before we started, and I straight away just said, I'm not interested in the climate change stuff. I've got my own opinion, right?
mm,
But this is what I think. And
yeah,
I immediately try to bridge the gap to what we have in common and what we do agree on,
mm,
right?
yeah,
But this is where I am. Do you know what I mean? So, but you and I had the most fantastic educational conversation, and educational for me because you said something about acceleration that, do you know, I've heard about this and it does interest me, right? But my purpose is always, I don't want to know where we're different. I want to know where we're the same.
mm.
And,
Interesting.
and
Yeah,
that's my purpose. I don't care what I
yeah,
don't agree with you on because
yeah.
your favorite color might be yellow. My favorite color might be pink. Doesn't mean that I'm a dickhead and you're not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
It just means we
yeah.
both have different favorite colors. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's right. Yeah.
That's all it means.
Although I got to. It's so funny you said yellow because for any photographers out there, yellow is really bad in shadows. So
Ah,
if you can
okay.
pull about 6% of yellow out of your shadows, your pictures have better color separation. So that's about one of the only post-production things that I do. Go into your color balance, pull about 6% of yellow just out of the shadows, and you'll see that all the colors look better for it. It's a bit of a blocking color, yellow. So
I didn't know
it's
that. Crikey.
no, well, that's just my hatred of yellow, really. But
But
I love it in a good sunset. But
but it's
but
it's
no, but yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that you say that because, I mean, the strange thing is and this is one of the wonders of technology is that
oh
you're sitting in the UK, I'm sitting in Melbourne. I've been in and out of, again, not name dropping or anything, but I've been in and out of all the Russian stans this year. I've been in New Guinea, I've been in Central Africa and West Africa and the Himalaya and the Pacific and everything like that. And yet we've had, to your point before, we've had to reschedule this and
yeah
multiple times. And yet we get there, we get there in the end, we keep persevering, and then we're using technology not as a divisive mechanism
no
by which to get political favor or to change ideology or anything like that. It's purely two humans on opposite sides of the planet. The original empire and the antipodes on the other side of the planet. To have a chin wag, as we say down here,
yeah
about life, the universe, and everything. And I think and for anyone who sort of hears this, I hope my waffling is sort of been entertaining enough to keep you engaged. But it's also one of those things that breaks down these barriers between cultures and communities and
yeah
things like that. That talking is not just a language in the literal sense. It's a language of connection. And I think that's I guess one of the things that I loved about going back through my field journals for the book is that I had that opportunity to connect with myself on a different level. So I've kept field journals for most of my career, And so I went back, and so there's journal entries in the book that are literally, if it says the 17th of February 1994 and the journal entry, that's literally what we pulled out on that date from that field journal. And then some of the captions for the pictures are actually field journal entries that we've just taken the date from, and you can sort
Yeah.
of tell in some cases. Um, but it's also one of those things that when I look back at that stuff, we actually, when you read it without context, when I read my own voice without context, let alone talking to you about it, sometimes the shoots are hard, or people don't want you to be there, or they're treating you badly, or they're robbing you, or they're doing whatever. And you'll pass some comment in a journal and you go, oh my God, I sound shocking. But I've also was there. I saw how badly I was being treated, or how people were being exploited or
Yeah.
killed or whatever, or animals were being butchered or whatever the case might be. The journal becomes that mechanism for me to get there at the end of the night when I'm sobbing because I've just photographed endangered species being butchered in a bushmeat market. I write down those thoughts because there's no one else to talk to. And then I have a bunch of stiff drinks and I cry. And then I get up the next morning and I go back, and all those animals are gone, and another lot of animals are back in there to be butchered or exploited. But it could be people, it could be whatever, it could be really joyous stuff. But having the opportunity to go back through the journal was interesting. So again, if you're one of these people that has often had the thought of journaling or something, I can't recommend it enough. It's like detox. It's you can write down a few words and never do it again, but you find, I think, once you start doing it, you don't have to do it every day. It's actually an interesting mechanism
It's,
for
it's, it's a very useful tool in therapy, is to keep writing until you can't stop. And then when you
really.
think you can't stop, just start writing blah, 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 my mum said, or my dad said, or my
Yeah,
uncle said, or the teacher said, or the ex-girlfriend said. And then just see
yeah.
if something else pops up, and you
Mm.
effectively, to some degree, leave it all on the page.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually one of those things that broke me. Lockdown broke me because Melbourne's lockdown was
Brutal.
unlawful. It went before the Hague as a crime against humanity and
Yeah.
everything. But I know that when I came out of it, just having to rebuild my craft and feel at one with myself, I know in the last couple of years I've struggled to journal because it's taken me a couple of years to give all my focus to creating my art, my imagery again. That even if I'm seeing the most amazing things, the energy is not there at the end of the day to put sometimes and often pen to paper, because what I've had left in the tank has gone into what I did during that day or that night or whatever. So, and I'm pretty, I've got a lot of stamina, but I've had to try and cut myself some slack as the last couple of years have gone by, and I'm not always successful at doing that, but try and cut myself a little bit of slack because I'm aware that I was so broken.
Yeah.
You know, I was beyond devastated, and thankfully I was home with and I wasn't alone or anything. But I lost 5 friends to suicide, and then we lost my sister-in-law to suicide, and everyone's got stories like this and things like that. I'm not alone, but my heart goes out to anyone who suffers, even post-pandemic or pre-pandemic in isolation, um, because it is loneliness and isolation is soul destroying, and it's hard to be creative. But sometimes if you can break into something creative when you're actually feeling that way, just one frame or one walk or one, like you say, one word or a couple of words in a journal or something like that, it is it is life changing. It is life changing to create when you are down is the hardest time, but the rewards are never greater than doing that. And some of the stories that I've documented are incredibly down, but I just know in myself I couldn't take a frame for 2.5 years. And when I finally got back on the road, I was calling my wife all the time, and I was sent down to Antarctica, and as I sailed south from the tip of South America to get to the ice, the crew that I was working with said, Jace, what do you want from this? We know you've been inside for a long time. And I said, I want 6 frames and to see my face in the mirror. And they didn't even know where to go with it. It was a French team.
Yeah.
And they said, okay. And they said, anything else? I said, I'd take less than 6 frames. I'd take a frame, but I need to see myself in the mirror. the person that I know myself to be. And I achieved that, but I sobbed a lot. I sobbed a lot during that assignment. And I watched that light, and I don't need a lot of sleep. I'm not an insomniac. I love sleep, but down there, the sun doesn't go down. It very rarely goes down. And I watched that light change, again and again and again. And there's a picture in the book of the Weddell Sea, which was the calmest I'd ever seen it, with these little penguins on this ice floe. And I watched that ice floe come towards the boat for hours. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning or something. And the pastel was just staggering, and these tiny little penguins. And I rang Megs on the satellite phone. I rang Megs on the phone, and she said, it's so nice. I could hear her tapping away because she's got a corporate role. She's out there in the world doing normal things. And I could hear in the background, she's in the office. And she said, darling, it's so wonderful to hear you,
Yeah,
to hear me. And I'm sobbing. And she said, I love you, but the world's spinning back here. Go back to light watching or go to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever. And so yeah, I've probably waffled on about that a little bit, but it is important for people to know that not every day is roses for everyone, and most people it's not often roses, but being creative when times are tough can I genuinely and heartfelt believe that it's one of the most important things that you can do, for yourself. Don't worry about anyone else. Just do it for yourself. It doesn't have to have an outcome outside of the fact that you make yourself feel better or think about something else for 5 minutes. That's the wonder of storytelling in whatever format you do it, whether you paint, you draw, you photograph, or you do weaving, or you write a journal or whatever. Just do something that makes, if you can do something that makes yourself feel better for 5 minutes, and then build on that.
and that's probably a great place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there you go. That was Jason and I putting the world to rights. And as I said at the beginning in the introduction, there is an amazing message there, because sometimes you're struggling and you don't realize it. Sometimes you think you're struggling and the struggle isn't as much as you think it is, but it definitely can feel that way. But you just don't know what is around a corner, what is around a bend, what may just happen. So, yeah, be creative, take a chance, follow your heart, and who knows what can happen. But above all, check out Jason, check out his book. And as I always say, I do appreciate everybody that listens and watches. I thank everybody for the comments, and wherever you're from, whatever you believe, please do take care and be blessed. Thank you.